this is the Mountain and Prairie Podcast. If this is your first time listening, the purpose of the podcast is to introduce you to some of the innovative and creative individuals who are helping to shape the future of the American West. I'll be chatting with a wide array of interesting people, from ranchers to writers, conservationists to entrepreneurs, athletes to artists, really anyone who does important work and has a fun story to tell. These are people I meet through my work as a Rocky Mountain ranch broker and through my hobbies that revolve around spending time up high in the mountains. And speaking of mountains, Colorado is world famous for its massive snow-capped peaks and all the outdoor activities that revolve around them. The mountains are what drew me to Colorado, and they're a big part of what makes the Colorado lifestyle so attractive to so many people. My guest today has built his career around preserving some of Colorado's mountains, while also working to ensure that the public can access the peaks without adversely affecting the fragile high-altitude ecosystem. Lloyd Athearn is the executive director of the Colorado 14ers Initiative, a nonprofit organization whose mission is to protect and preserve the natural integrity of Colorado's 14,000-foot peaks through active stewardship and public education. The 14ers Initiative builds and maintains trails, educates hikers and climbers on best practices in the high country, conserves the native alpine tundra, and generally helps to ensure that these mountains are not inadvertently destroyed from overuse. We had a wide-ranging conversation that covered a lot of interesting topics. We talked about why 14ers need to be protected, some of the specific methods that CFI uses to monitor the mountains, advice for those who are interested in hiking their first 14er, as well as advice for young people who'd like to work in an outdoor, conservation-focused industry. It was a great conversation full of lots of useful information, so I hope you enjoy it. Before we get started, I want to thank our sponsor, Mountain Khakis. Mountain Khakis is an outdoor apparel company based out of Jackson Hole, Wyoming that makes some of my favorite clothing. It's perfect for life in the American West, durable, versatile, and comfortable. The company started back in 2003 making rugged pants for life in the outdoors, but since then they've expanded their offerings to include shirts, shorts, jeans, and hats. With the snow finally melting here in Colorado, I'd suggest you check out some of their shorts. I really like the poplin shorts. I have 3 pairs and I'm actually wearing some right now. So go to mountainkhakis.com to see their full selection or check them out on social media. Just go to Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and type in @mountainkhakis. All right, we're going. So I guess the first question that I've asked people is, when you meet people, whether it's at a networking event or just randomly somewhere, and they ask you what you do for a living, what do you tell them?
The answer to that always varies based on whether people are in Colorado, whether they're outdoor people.
Yep.
If I'm in some other part of the country and I say I run an organization that works on the 14ers, there's a lot of head scratching and like, what's that?
Yeah.
But around here, I can say that I'm, the executive director of Colorado 14ers Initiative, that we work on trail building, alpine conservation, and stewardship and education on the 14,000-foot peaks here in Colorado.
It's funny you say that about people from outside of Colorado, because I was having lunch with some people the other day from North Carolina, and I was just kept casually throwing out the term 14er, and finally one of the people said, "What does that mean? I don't know what that means." And so can you explain for people who aren't here in Colorado, what is a 14er?
Sure. 14er is a name that's given to the mountains that are over 14,000 feet in elevation. Mm-hmm. Obviously, that only makes sense in America, where we're about the only country that still uses the old imperial measurements. Yeah. Probably would be, 4,500 meters or something?
Sure.
A very different measurement. But they are really only 3 states in the lower 48 that have 14ers. Mm-hmm. Colorado has more than 50. California somewhere about 15, 16, I think. Mm-hmm. And Washington has 1. Mm-hmm. So only a few states in the West, and the ones here are a bit different than those in California and Washington.
And so how many are there officially? Because I know when you're looking online, some people say they're 54, some people say they're 58. What's the official word on that?
At some level, that's one of those how many angels can dance on the head of a pin argument, and there are people who believe different things. There are, let me sort of break it down. There are 58 named points of land that have an elevation over 14,000 feet. those don't all technically qualify as separate mountains because there's some criteria that mountain-related organizations have put up that talk about the lateral distance between points, the extent to which, if you're following a connecting ridge, you drop down in elevation. So in the end, there are only 53 mountains that qualify as meeting all of these criteria. Historically, climbers have used the number 54 because there are some of the peaks that, while not meeting the technical criteria, are, from a mountaineering perspective, real challenging peaks. Sure. And there are some that do meet the criteria that aren't so much. So things like North Maroon Peak, El Diente Peak, historically have been viewed as 14ers and mountaineering challenges in their own right. They don't technically qualify.
Got it. Yeah, the one there with Democrat, Bross, and Lincoln, and then I guess Cameron.
Cameron is just, a bump on the ridge. You would hardly notice it.
I still hit it though when I was up there.
Oh, of course, people do, and some will take little signs about the peak, and a lot of people will climb it. Personally, when I did it, I was like, it's not even much of a peak.
Yeah.
There's another one called Conundrum Peak, which is next to Castle Peak out in the Elks.
Yep.
And when you climb Castle, and when you go down the ridge over there were several little knobs on the ridge, and I was like, well, the one that I thought was higher isn't actually the one that they said is higher. And I was like, okay, and that gives you an idea of some of the points that don't really qualify as 14ers.
Sure.
Some of them are pretty indistinct.
Yeah, it's interesting because whenever I'm up there, if I have the opportunity to hit a summit, I want to, but then you think, wow, did it count towards the list? But that means I'm not thinking about it properly. I need to be in it, not checking things off a list. I think I need to be enjoying being in the mountains.
Well, and then you hit on a funny point. One of my colleagues who's climbed all of the 14ers, he also then went to do, there's I think North Mount Massive and some others that are just underneath 14,000. And he said, look, I'm getting older. If somehow along the line with upthrust of the continent or something they changed to 14, I don't want to have to go back when I'm 70 and go climb these peaks. Some people obsess about the details, others just are out there having fun.
Yeah, I guess you can do whatever you want up there. It's definitely fun though. So for another question for people that are not in Colorado, when you think of a mountain, especially a 14,000 foot mountain, you think of something that's solid, it's never going to go anywhere, at least not for millions of years. So why do these mountains need protecting?
That is the inherent paradox of the work that we do. People from afar see the mountains and they see the rock, they see the snow, they think enduring, durable, rugged, why do you need to protect these? The reality is that the high peaks in Colorado, not just the 14ers, but especially the 14ers, have a thin layer of alpine tundra vegetation that contains plants that are rare in the United States, sometimes rare in the world. The Colorado mountains have the largest concentration of alpine tundra vegetation in the lower 48. And because we're at the southern terminus of these plant communities that extend up into the Arctic, you've ended up having some plants that exist here that don't exist elsewhere, some really rare plants. And they are incredibly well adapted to living at these environments, the high ultraviolet radiation, the difference in temperature over the course of a day and over the course of a year, but they are extremely vulnerable to trampling. If you step on these plants 5 to 10 times, you can set back their growth dramatically or kill them outright. And when they are set back, it'll take them 10 to 1,000 times slower to regrow than plants that might just be another 1,000 or 2 feet lower in the forested areas. So the combination of rare and fragile plant cover and an exploding use in population on these peaks, and the fact that when we started 22 years ago, there were only 2 planned routes on the 14ers. It has created this natural impact of erosion and steep trails that were never adequately planned. So CFI is in the business of developing a network of trails that are sustainably designed, durably constructed, and built to protect the resource while allowing hiking to occur.
So you said 40 years ago there were only 2 designated routes.
Just 22 years ago.
22 years ago.
Yeah. So CFI started in 1994.
Okay.
And at that point, there was just the Keyhole route on Longs Peak and the Bar Trail on Pikes Peak.
Really?
All of the other use that was occurring on the 14ers was just climbers going out and saying, there's the summit, here's the trailhead, what's the most obvious direct route to get there? And since a lot of this use occurs during the summer when you have thunderstorms in the afternoon, people were not looking for extraneous circuitous routes. It was like, let me get up and down as quickly as possible. Yep. So you start going up and down this fragile plant cover and you trample the plants and the plants die and their root structure lets go of this thin alpine soil that has taken 1,000 years an inch to develop. And all of a sudden you've got, 12,000 years of evolutionary process just eroding down the hill and smothering other plants. And when the minute a trail gets scoured and eroded and loose, people say, oh, that's uncomfortable, and so they'll step out onto the tundra. Pretty soon you can have multiple what we call trail braids, where there are separate trails. On one route on Mount Elbert we're going to be doing in a couple of years, there are seven trails right next to each other.
Really?
And all of the soil in between is starting to erode and fall over, and pretty soon you have areas that can be 20, 50, 100 feet wide with all of the plant cover destroyed.
So how do you even begin to prioritize which mountains to work on? Because you got 54, 58 different peaks, and Mount Elbert's a really popular one, and that's a perfect example. But I imagine once after you've worked on a peak, maybe 4 or 5 years later, it probably needs more work. So what's CFI's method for prioritizing the projects?
Sure. Well, when the effort started more than 20 years ago, there was an inventory process where they tried to get a handle on what are the peaks that need the use, that need the work most, that have some of the highest use, and they tackled that, and we have been trying to implement that. A couple of years ago, I was meeting with some folks who were partners of ours working on a project, and they worked at Booz Allen Hamilton, the consulting firm. And they said, have you really thought about what you're doing here in terms of you have a more than 15 years of work that's been developed, and you've spent millions of dollars on this. How are you managing those trails? How are you prioritizing what's going on in the future? And they helped us really craft a process for going out and inventorying. We did 42 routes across the 14ers, and some of them were planned and constructed routes. Others were things that we're putting Band-Aids on, climber-created routes, and really tried to, with uniform criteria, say what are the highest needs, what are the highest priorities. We're also in a second phase of this, what we're calling our Sustainable Trails project, where we're putting very compact infrared trail counters on a number of the peaks so that we can see what the use levels are and when it's occurring, so that we can begin assembling all of this and really say, here's where use is driving on the ground impacts. Here's where we've developed trails and they seem to be holding well. And we can then both be able to get a sense of priority as well as identify specifically what needs to be done, how much that's going to cost, how many person hours, how many dollars per hour it's going to take. And then we can both target resources to the highest priority projects, as well as tell funders if they have a particular geographic interest, here's what you can buy for a given amount of money to do this work, and almost have an a la carte menu of the work that needs to be done and how much it's going to cost, and people can order off the menu.
Yeah, I remember being at a presentation you did, and you went through, you had some slides showing some of the maps of, or I guess satellite images, Google Earth images of the 14ers, and how I guess you had some of your volunteers or staff members go through, and maybe every 20 or 30 feet they evaluate the trail on the way up, and is that can you kind of explain how that works?
We ended up to make sure that we were getting rigorously collected and identical information on all of the peaks. We had one person do the inventory. I know it's popular these days to have crowdsourcing, but the reality is that most people who use trails, and I was as guilty of this as someone who had climbed for decades and spent time on lots and lots of trails, I didn't know anything about what a properly constructed trail looks like and where you would need a feature, whether you needed to, some sort of a check step that holds the soil back or retaining walls or things like that. So we decided that after working with the Forest Service and working with the Booz Allen consultants, that we came up with a set of criteria to apply. And then literally every foot along a trail, my colleague Ben was inventorying, noting, okay, here's something that was previously built and it's falling apart and it needs annual maintenance or it needs complete reconstruction, so we could assign number grades to that. If something new needed to be built or something old needed to be repaired, he'd look around, where is the native material that we're going to get, how far away, how much time is it going to take to move it over there. So it ended up having somewhere more than 20,000 data points, all GPS located on these 42 trails. So we knew exactly what would need to be done. And when I say we needed to look to find the materials on site, that differs radically from peak to peak. So for example, we had a few years of work on Mount of the Holy Cross out near the Vale Valley.
That's a
beautiful mountain, and so much rock that's perfectly configured for us to work with. And when the crews were working on that, they'd just look 3 feet off the trail corridor, and here's a perfect rock. Meanwhile, on Maroon Peak out near Aspen, it was taking our crews an average of 2 hours to find, quarry, and bring to the trail corridor a rock to work with. So obviously the time constraints on Holy Cross versus Maroon totally different. So the cost is going to be totally different.
That's I really think that's a really smart way to do things. The way you guys have marked those data points and you throw it in spreadsheets and you can quantify everything. Have you seen has that made it easier to raise money? I know it's never easy raising money. My wife raises money for a living, but I would imagine being able to go to somebody with these spreadsheets that you've got some history as to how it cost and how much it cost in the past, and then you can project what it's going to cost in the future, and you can just throw it in front of these people and say, this is what we need. Has that really helped you a lot?
That has helped out tremendously. It allows us to go to different funders and people who have an interest in particular peaks and say, this is the challenge, this is what it's going to take in terms of time, effort, money, and like I say, there's sort of almost like an a la carte menu where people can say, I want to work on this peak, or I only have X amount of money that I could give to you. How could you apply it, and how much work could you get done? It allows us to be very specific. Now, it also allows us, after doing this baseline inventory, to go back and see how conditions have changed over time. And in the process of submitting a grant that thankfully got funded, that's going to allow us to complete inventories on, there were about 14 or 16 additional peaks routes that we didn't get to for various reasons the first go around. So we're going to be able to, starting in 2017, complete those baseline inventories and begin going back to the routes that were first inventoried in 2011 and see how things have changed. Well, to help produce that grant request, I had Ben go out to 3 different peaks. One of them was Holy Cross, where we'd had concentrated staff presence for 3 years between the initial inventory to when the secondary inventory was done. Gray's and Torrey's peaks, where we had at least 6 volunteer projects a year on it. And that was kind of our mid-investment case. And then to Mount Chavano, where we hadn't done a thing. And we were able to see how conditions had changed. So the good part was that our report card grade for Holy Cross had gone from a C to an A minus because of that concentrated investment. Gray's and Torrey's actually slipped slightly. It went from like a C to a C minus. And when we started looking at it in more of a 3-dimensional way, we were able to say, we've made progress and we've improved the trail condition on the lower altitude sections that are easier for volunteers to get to. But we slipped, and by a greater degree, at the higher altitude areas where we really need trained crews who are super fit, who are out there every day and can go all the way up to the 14,000 foot summit to do those higher stretches. That's the challenge. And then Chavano, which was already one of the worst, most expensive trails in the state to fix, it just went from an F to a Blutarski like F minus.
Really?
If that's possible. So by the inventory, the baseline inventories, and being able to go back and do secondary inventories, adding the hiker count information, we'll be able to see how conditions are changing, how much of that looks like it's stemming from increased use, and how much of it might be related to just a problem with the trail design or construction.
Yeah.
Because we had one project out on San Luis Peak, which is arguably the least visited in the state. And when we had a crew out there, I think the highest total they ever saw were 10 climbers.
Oh, really?
And most days nobody was out there. There was still significant damage just because of the handful of people who'd gone out there, and they were going straight up hills and so forth. So impact is not directly correlated to use.
That's interesting. Do you have general estimates of, say, how many people do grazing tours in a year?
We've had a trail counter out there on grazing tours the last couple of years. We've had some data gaps as people have messed with.
Yeah, I remember you said that sometimes people would put rocks in front of the counters by accident.
We have on some of the peaks when we're above timberline, we have to bury these counters in rock cairns adjacent to the trail. And I hadn't known this, but there are some people who every time they pass a cairn, they think it's good luck to put a rock on there. So that's okay if you're putting it up on the top, but where if we have this small little gap and we have the little sensor reading through there, and little Johnny comes along and puts a rock there, all of a sudden we're not collecting data until we go back and remove it. So, but on grazing tories, on Quandary, on Elbert, some of the Front Range and most signature peaks in the state, we're getting 25,000 people is our estimate. And that use is confined really to 4 months from June through the end of September, but even more confined to kind of mid-June through mid-July is the peak time.
Yeah, it's amazing when, sometimes if I'm driving by, I do some work down in South Park, and when I go up towards Breckenridge, I'll do Quandary if I have time. And, in the off season, there's nobody there, even in the fall when there's not much snow. But you go up there in the summer, and it's just full of people. And you guys' work is very important because they would destroy the mountain otherwise, It's just, that's a lot of impact.
There is, and a lot of people, these peaks are some of the most visible and popular Forest Service destinations in the country. And so people come from all over to climb these peaks, and a lot of them don't understand about the fragility of the natural resources. And, nobody's intentionally trying to do damage, but if the trail isn't well designed and easy to follow, people are going to get off route and cause impact. So
and I agree with you. Very, very, very few people go up there with the intention of tearing something up. It's just a lot of people just don't know, and that's one of the great things about these mountains like Quandary or Grazing Tories, that people who have never really climbed a 14er, never really done much outdoor activity can go out there and do it. And then they fall in love with it and they learn more about it, and then they get into donating to you guys or donating to other conservation organizations. I think it's doing a 14er is a great kind of gateway drug into caring about the mountains and the landscape out here. At least it was for me. Definitely. I mean, that's when the first time I ever came out here was in high school. I went to the Arkansas River Valley and did Mount Yale, and I mean that was that's what got me into all this stuff. So. You talking about your funders, can you talk a little bit about how you guys are funded? I know you, on your website, you have some corporate partnerships with different outdoor companies. I know you get some grants from the government. Can you kind of explain how you guys pay for the work you do?
Yeah, of necessity, we have a very diverse funding source. 1% of all charitable giving in the country goes to environment and animal related causes. So you think everything from large conservation groups like the Nature Conservancy to zoos and animal shelters and so forth. And even within that 1%, if you split it down, a niche activity like CFI's alpine stewardship and trail construction is at the shallow end of the pool. So we have to try really hard and assemble a whole diverse mix of funders. We thankfully in Colorado have our state lottery proceeds directed through Great Outdoors Colorado to parks and open space, and we compete through some competitive grants that the State Parks and Wildlife Agency has. They're a big chunk of funding for us. There's a group called the National Forest Foundation out of Missoula, Montana, that has been a very, very strong funder of ours. We've increasingly tried to connect to communities throughout the state, the mountain communities that have that trailhead economic impact. So, City of Aspen, Pitkin County, Town of Breckenridge, some of the Summit County local governments. So we get some of those government grants. We also try to engage the 14er enthusiasts across the country. We had last year about 1,400 donors from 44 states, District of Columbia, and 4 international countries that give to us. Sometimes hard to find those people and let them know who we are because we can't advertise out on the peaks. And then we do corporate partnerships with both outdoor industry companies. So, REI has been a mainstay supporter of ours for many years. Osprey Packs has been a big funder. We also try to work with civic-minded and outdoor-oriented companies that to do teamwork, trail building projects. A Kaiser Permanente is a big partner of ours that gets people out to work. Yep.
And speaking of having crews out there working on the trails and doing all the work you do, I know that you do have youth crews. Is that correct?
Yeah. Over the last 5 years, we had more than 60% of our volunteer work come from youth, young adults. So kids who are in youth summer camps, college outdoor programs. Good example is Colorado College, where their new students coming onto campus will do a service learning project with some group, and we end up working with somewhere about a quarter of all of the incoming students to that college come up on like a 3-4 day project with us. So the youth projects are really great in the sense that there's a good overlay with the time off that you have, whether you're in high school and college, and our limited work season over the summer. It also provides us with a great educational opportunity when you're out there to say, hey, these are these plants, see the little plant that looks like it's in the 6-pack at the garden store at the beginning of spring. Well, that's a 30-year-old plant, and that's all the bigger that's going to get. And if you step on it 10 times, that might die. And, sometimes that could be a plant that only lives on this mountain.
Yeah. That's really interesting. What a great opportunity for those kids to get out there. That's really could be life-changing, especially if somebody's coming to Colorado College from the East Coast to be up there, that high altitude doing that hard work. That's
it's eye-opening and mind expanding.
Oh, sure. So I'm in the private land business, and a lot of these 14ers are on public land, but every now and then I know that there are some issues, access issues to the 14ers because there may be private land that a trail crosses, an old mining claim or something like that. Do you have any interesting stories about that? I remember years ago when I was going to do Lincoln and Bross Democrat, there was some issues with a trail closure up high because it crossed over a mining claim.
Right.
Do you could you explain how that works to people?
Sure. So there are throughout the Rocky Mountains a lot of these old historic mining claims. Now some ended up becoming working mines, and others were just areas where people were prospecting. But due to mining law, people would be able to claim that land as their own, and it became, you patent the mining claim, it becomes private land. So we have some places. You mentioned the Lincoln Democrat Bross group out of Alma. very popular route where you can hit, if you're counting Cameron, you can hit 4 summits in one loop trail. Well, much of the route was all over old mining areas, many of which had been active. And in the mid 2000s, the landowners grew concerned about liability if someone got hurt. There were old abandoned mine structures and mine shafts and things like that. Yeah. And there was a concern that they might get sued if someone got hurt. So they had closed down access. CFI was involved in working with then Governor Owens to get some additions made to our recreational use statute that would have further protected the private landowners. We also worked to configure the route such that it was only staying on land where people were giving us permission to cross. So that's by and large been resolved. There's still always ongoing issues of if the landowner changes perspective.
Sure.
One that is a good example of where CFI is trying to resolve private access issues is on Mount Chavano, down near Salida.
Sure.
Probably about 95% of the route is on Forest Service land, but as you approach the summit, you go through a saddle area, and there are 11 long strips of mining claims that are up there, and both where the existing user-created route goes and where the Forest Service plan new route goes, crosses private land. And the Forest Service won't let us address what is one of the highest priority, biggest disaster routes that we have in the state until we get the permission from the private landowner. So we are working with the Forest Service to try to collaboratively acquire these lands, bring them into public ownership. If the owners aren't willing to sell, at least get some sort of access easement to allow the trail to be built. There are probably about 5 or 6 peaks with these private access issues, large to small. Culebra is entirely on a private ranch, so if we only had whatever it is, $120 million or so, we could get that trail going.
that we're listing that for sale. Did you know that?
Well,
I can get you a deal on it.
I think you were. Maybe you can cut us a nonprofit rate on that one.
That's even though I've been selling ranches for over 10 years now, it always amazes me how some of these landowners just out of some principle will not grant an easement in a case like that, because you think up high on Bross and Democrat, people are going to walk over it no matter what, and so you think they would just give an easement or sell you part of it, but I don't know. It's people.
It is private land, and we on our website and whenever we're talking about it say, look, you need to respect private property rights and only cross if people allow you to do it. And as much as you want to go climb a route, if it's not allowed, you should respect that. There are a lot of people who will go out and do it regardless.
Sure.
But it makes it harder for everyone else if those private rights aren't respected.
Yeah, I agree with you. And so is there a certain 14er that you guys have worked on over the years that's kind of a great success story that you would model your other projects after? Is there one particular that comes to mind?
Well, we've been doing this work for more than 20 years, so we take pride in the whole body of work that we've done. Some of the peaks that I look at as being really great examples, in Chicago Basin there are 3 14ers out there: Wyndham, Sunlight, and Aeolus, and we've done some of our most technical and most remote work out in that region. We're going to be working this summer on Mount Aeolus to finish up the last of the trails in that area. And these are ones that have incredibly elaborate trail design and rock staircases.
Because they're relatively technical, all 3 of those, right?
Yes. We're not doing the route all the way to the summit.
Sure.
We're doing the route through the vegetated terrain, and usually once you get into third class terrain, even harder second class terrain where you're having to scramble, we're not going to build a route there. We're not going to remove the inherent challenge of the peak. But even getting up to the approach areas involves very, very technical rock staircases to be constructed.
Sure.
We had one on North Maroon Peak where there were 69 linked rock steps going up this moraine field.
That would be hard work if you're doing it at the beach, but the idea of being at 12, 13,000 feet, throwing those rocks around, that's...
Well, you have to go find the rock, bring it over, and figure out how it can fit. And again, all of this is being done by hand. We're not using machine tools or anything like that. And, you don't have hours to be chipping away at the rock just to make it fit,
sure.
Right? So it involves some really skilled technical rock work
sure.
by our crew leaders, and some of them are some of the best in the country that come work with us.
That's really cool. You mentioned just now about the different classes of class 1, 2, 3. Can you explain that just for people who don't know?
So in hiking / climbing, you have what are known as class ratings. So class 1 is just a maintained trail. Class 2 is when you're off trail, but you're rarely having to use your hands to assist in climbing. Third class is when you really are on all fours much of the time, where you're making sure you're having your 3 points of contact. Fourth class is when you're doing that, but the risk of falling is much more significant, and the consequences of doing so would be more serious. And then fifth class is when most people will be using ropes and climbing protection harnesses, those sorts of things. So we focus principally on the class 1 and sometimes into the easy class 2 trail construction. When it gets above that, you'd really be changing the whole nature of the experience for the hiker / climber. So we don't want to build stairways and elevators to the top of these mountains and dumb them down in the experience.
I think I saw something on your Facebook page on April 1st about building a staircase or building a escalator or something up Quandary Peak.
Yeah, well, we try to have some fun, and some of our most followed posts have over the years been our April Fool's spoof posts. So yeah, this year we were going to put the escalator up Quandary Peak to make that more approachable and less damaging. Yeah. A couple of years ago, we did one where, by happenstance, the peaks we were working on were some of the lowest altitude 14ers. So we said, we're going to quarry the rocks from the summit of the peak as we're making these stair steps and retaining walls. Yeah. And by the time we're done, the peaks will be under 14,000 feet. So nobody's going to want to climb them when they're 13ers. And we will have reduced the impact by limiting the amount of people.
Does anybody ever take it seriously?
Oh, that is the art of trying to get just up to that line and maybe even a little across it to where some people are going to freak out and think you've totally lost your mind. And just pay attention to future April Fool's days, because we have some other things that we're working on.
It's funny to watch people's reaction to that stuff. I love The Onion, and every time they put an article, there's always a few people that comment thinking it's real.
Yes.
Just some crazy story. Yes. So one of the reasons I started doing this podcast is because I meet all these really interesting people who are doing interesting work, but they're also very interesting themselves. And when we first met, I thought that about you and your work history and just how you kind of got into this. And so I was wondering if we could just talk about a little bit about your personal background and how you got to where you are now. So where did you grow up?
Well, I was born in the Bay Area. My father's family was from California. My mother's family was from Oregon. And born in Berkeley, grew up in Portland, Oregon, always in sight of Mount Hood. And, I've always been a very physical outdoor person. I was a runner and cyclist as a kid. And, every day, especially like when I was in high school and I went to school across town, I'd be on the bus and I'd see sunrise with Mount Hood and I'd think, that's so cool. Yeah. And wanted to climb it. My father had been an avid backpacker and adventurer. And, I can point back to a backpacking trip where I had my 13th birthday. And, this is back in the 70s when parents were a little looser. Yeah. They didn't have apps to track their kids all the time. And my father, stepmother, and my sisters were interested in doing an easier route from one day's camp to the next day's camp. And my father was like, yeah, you can go off by yourself when you're 13 over a high pass in Tuolumne Meadows in Yosemite. And it was one of the defining days of my life.
Really?
Where I just, I was convinced there were bears coming out from every tree. And, that it was like, oh my God, I'm on the edge of what I could do. But when I got to these high alpine passes and I saw marmots and the snow up there, and I was like, this is cool. How do I figure a way to do this? Well, I was in Boy Scouts and did a lot of outdoor stuff. In high school, we'd have Backpacker magazine wedged into our folders in class when, kind of reading that, hoping no one's going to pay attention. I always had this love of the mountains and being outside, and I had, through my coursework in college, had really focused on public policy, political science, history. I, out of college, got working for some elected officials in the state of Oregon.
Okay.
I did lobbying, communications. In my high school, we had an NPR station, so I was a radio announcer growing up. So there was always this confluence between public policy and media and issues, but I found I was always working on someone else's issues. And in my spare time, avocationally, I was just obsessed in my 20s and early 30s with climbing and mountains. Every spare moment was going climbing. And 20 years ago, I had this amazing stroke of luck where I was able to come out to Colorado to work for the American Alpine Club, a national climbing and mountaineering organization. And I worked there for 10 years, focusing on climbing access and policy throughout the country. Got me to go to Denali and, Yosemite and the Tetons and so many cool places to work on issues. And spent a little time in private land conservation. And 7 years ago, my wife foolishly said, I was looking to make a move, and she said, there's the 14ers initiative is here in Golden, and that would be perfect for you. And I think she regrets saying that because it's become a full-scale addiction, working on this organization and these peaks and helping protect the resource and helping allow people to have the opportunities to go do what are life-changing activities. If you grow up in a lot of this country, you don't have things like these peaks in your backyard. And if you come here, this is, for most people, like climbing Mount Everest. It is something that on their dying day, they're thinking, I remember the time I was out in Colorado and we climbed Peak X. And that was so cool. And you're doing it with your friends and your family, and you're pushing your limits of ability. So part of the driving force for me is making sure that, my son, and if he has kids and other people out throughout the country, can have those life-changing experiences, some of just the most beautiful, spectacular places in the world. And, then fight for their protection so that future generations have those experiences.
Yeah, I agree with what you said about people, kind of being big-time life memories by coming out here, because I was talking with a father of one of my friends from back in North Carolina, and they're coming out this summer and they're planning their entire family vacation around climbing Mount Elbert, the highest peak. And so, and you think that's just one person out of the whole country, and you got people from all over 40 some countries wanting to do that every year. One thing, I get a lot of calls from young people who want to get into the conservation world. And your job to a lot of people seems like a dream job, and kind of your career path working at the American Alpine Club and now this. Would you have any advice for young people who are interested in a career in the outdoors, outdoor advocacy, any kind of a career that would mirror yours?
I do. I mean, I'd have to preface it. It's kind of funny that having worked in some of these positions where people say, that's got to be a dream job. It's much like friends I have who have become mountain guides, and sometimes the experience changes when, like, if you're going out to climb just with your friends versus if you're taking clients.
Sure.
Sometimes these jobs can be so all-consuming that it changes your relationship with the activity. So I say that just as a cautionary tale, but it is amazing every day to be able to get up and say, wow, I'm doing something cool. The hard part is almost like with any addiction, being able to say, when do I put boundaries about doing it? But in terms of if someone wants to pursue that career, I think the first part is to realize you have to have the personal passion for this work. You have to have something that's really motivating you. But you also have to get the hard skills. Most of the outdoor related environmental advocacy and conservation groups are pretty small. So you have to wear multiple hats. You're not going to be able to get any of these jobs if you just know one thing. You're going to have to figure out the way that you can add value in a number of different skill sets. So, for example, as I mentioned, I, as a high schooler, was able to work as a radio announcer. I then worked in politics, where I did a lot of media communication. I worked on issues. I then learned the great art of fundraising, which people find sometimes intimidating, but really is just about getting people excited about what you're doing. So if you're working in nonprofits, you usually need to know some of the hard skills. You need to be good with people. You need to be able to communicate what's special about this work that you're doing to the lay public using multimedia techniques. You're oftentimes influencing elected officials, so figuring out how to do that. So broad-based skills, the more that you can understand the technical skills. I'm always amazed at some of the skills that my colleagues have in terms of GIS and some of those harder skills that I don't have. So the more that people can know that, know the botany, know the technical details, that makes them stronger. But you still have to be able to integrate with people and get them fired up.
Sure.
No one's going to give their money if they're just looking at your technical report.
Sure. Well, I think that's what you guys are so good at, because I've been to several of your fundraising events, and you've got kind of the perfect balance of the quantitative hard numbers, but then the beautiful photos and the beautiful stories, and you can look at those quantitative numbers, and then you can look at kind of the big picture and how beautiful it is. And everybody out here has a connection to the 14ers in some way, and so it's kind of the perfect storm. I'm not saying it's easy. I think you guys have worked very hard to kind of get that pitch in place, but I think you guys do a great job with that.
Well, the friends who always say, they'll respond to like a Facebook post when in the summer I've been out, collecting data on a peak, and I share pictures of it and the marmots and pikas. Yeah. They're like, you have a dream job. Yeah. It's like, well, come by in fall when I'm working 6 days a week and until 11 o'clock at night hitting deadlines on fundraising proposals. Not quite as glamorous on those days.
I don't think there's any job, no matter how cool it seems, there's no job that's the perfect dream job. It wouldn't be if it was just all fun the whole time. Right. You gotta work hard.
Exactly.
So for anybody who's listening to this who wants to come out here and do a 14er, do you have any advice for a first-time person? Which mountain would be a good one to start with? Kind of what you should, general guidelines for what you should do for getting up to the top and down, before the thunderstorms come in?
Sure. Well, the first thing is to have people pick a suitable objective. That usually is going to be one of our more approachable, less technical peaks in the Front Range or close in Saguache Range. Yep. You think of Gray's Torreys, Quandary Peak, Mount Elbert. Those are some of the ones that are, if you're a fit hiker, you're not going to be exceeding your abilities. So other things to keep in mind are that this is an activity that's going to take many hours to do. And if you're coming from some other part of the country and you're not endowed with all of the great red blood cells that we get from living here, understand it's going to take a number of hours. Could be 6, 8, 10, 12 hours to do a peak. So you need to start early. Yep. You need to make sure you have adequate water. So easily 3 liters of water. You're going to need to have high energy food, snacks to eat along the way. Mm-hmm. Make sure you have several layers of progressively warmer clothing. That you're going to have a waterproof, breathable shell. You're going to have a hat. You're going to. One of the things that we see a lot is people going light and fast. Mm-hmm. So they have tennis shoes or light trail running shoes. That can get you beat up over some of these trails. And when people get sore feet, then they're thinking, well, I'm going to get off the rocky trail and over onto that nice, lush tundra vegetation, cause a lot of impact. So wear boots, trekking poles, especially with a number of decades of this activity under my knees. It's always good to have those. Be sensible about it and be humble about it. The mountains are always going to be there. People oftentimes get into trouble when they get too overzealous. They go for a peak that's beyond their abilities. They get a late start. Mm-hmm. They get caught in the thunderstorms in the afternoon. They don't have extra clothes. Mm-hmm. It's those usually succession of errors that cause people to need to be rescued and to put themselves and their partners in jeopardy.
Yeah, I think one thing that's always important to remember, whether you're doing Grazing Torreys or Mount Everest, is that the summit is halfway. I think a lot of people see it as the finish line, but for me personally, going downhill is much harder for me than going up. I can go up all day, but like my knees aren't what they used to be, and I can find myself kind of stumbling downhill. And I would much rather be hustling uphill than down, and it'd be a scary deal to get up on the summit and have lightning going around and realize you got 2 hours to get down.
Some people end up with a tunnel-like summit fever.
I've had it before.
They're figuring out their caloric expenditures, and they're thinking, if I just get there, and they've burned all of their energy up. They've been focusing on the trail and not looking at the clouds. I always have my head on the swivel, looking around, like, look at that cloud. Well, is that a benign cloud? Is it starting to grow into a thunderhead? And people can really get into trouble if they don't have enough equipment. They've started late. They expended all their resources to get to the summit, and they were so myopically focused on that summit that they didn't see that there were storm clouds approaching. They might be coming from behind you, so you don't want to end up there and like, I'm totally spent. I don't have gear, and it's starting to thunder and lightning. I mean, that is a bad place to be.
It really is bad. And if you've ever come close, it probably won't happen again, because when the first few times I started going up in the mountains around here, I never got in a really bad situation, but there are a few times where those clouds can develop from a nice looking, beautiful little summertime cloud into a scary thunderhead really quickly, and you never forget it.
And if you aren't familiar with an area, you don't understand what's normal. And I got into trouble once in Ecuador on one of the volcanoes there when we had been dropped off at the trailhead, and we were going up to this high altitude hut. And my partner and I got stuck in this thunderstorm, and my head's felt like 1,000 bees had inhabited my skull. And I was just terrified for probably a good half hour down in that emergency position, thinking,
really?
Oh yeah, it was not fun. And you're on this volcanic cone, so there was no shelter. There was no place to hide.
It was buzzing. Was any metal on you buzzing?
Oh yeah, I'd thrown my pack down and my ice axe and those sorts of things, and I was crouched down. I was like, please, when's this going to be over? And that moment, the fear of that moment is still with me, almost 20 years later. So yeah, you don't want to get caught out in thunderstorms here. People die. We are the second highest lightning fatality state in the country, and probably on a per capita basis, or it might even be.
What's first, Florida?
Florida, I think, has the most overall fatalities, just because it's flat as a pancake.
Sure.
But here, so many of the lightning fatalities are up on the high peaks.
Yeah. Yeah, you can feel very, very helpless very quickly when you start buzzing like that. I had it happen one time, and I'll never forget it. It's so scary. So in the past episodes, I've had these kind of rapid fire questions, and your answer doesn't have to be rapid, but just kind of general questions that I think listeners can get some good value from. For you, one question I have that I haven't asked the other people is, what's your favorite 14er? Do you have a favorite?
It's a hard choice. I mean, so many memories with so many different peaks, and especially those I've climbed multiple times. But I would have to say that El Diente Peak, which is technically a non-14er. It doesn't really count, but I think it does.
Yeah.
Climbed that last summer as I was out looking the work that our crew did in the Kilpacker Basin. It is spectacularly beautiful.
Really?
You have this route that sort of moves around the mountain. It gets into third class in some spots, and then you have this nice little airy summit. And did it on a perfect day with one of my colleagues last year, and I was like, I've never done that. That's a memory that will last. So down in the San Juans, a little bit south of Telluride.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to be down there this summer, so I'll put that on the list. I did Wetterhorn years ago, and it kind of reminds me of how you just described that.
Yeah, that was my previously favorite.
Oh, really?
14er.
That's my favorite. Yeah,
got bumped out a little bit.
All right. Well, I'm going to put that on my list. I always like asking people about books that they read that they enjoy. Do you have any favorite books or books that you would recommend about the West? It doesn't have to be related to mountains. Just any book that has been meaningful to you in your career and life out here.
Sure. Well, I don't know that it particularly ties in with too much, except an early political campaign I ran. But a couple of summers ago, I read the book Astoria about the settlement, John Jacob Astor and his fur trading settlement. When I was younger and worked in politics, I'd run for a month a political campaign out on the North Oregon coast. So very familiar with Astoria, and learning about the settlement of that area and really how this was in 1815. I mean, very early, and Oregon became a state in 1859. So the difference between that was the most isolated northern Oregon through Washington and British Columbia coast was the last area in the world of coastline to get mapped outside of the Arctic and Antarctic.
Oh yeah,
and just a spectacular book about
the history. I thought that book was so good. It's kind of like the sequel to Lewis and Clark, because Lewis and Clark went, and then these guys were the first commercial expedition, I guess. And I just cannot imagine surviving in that environment in the Pacific Northwest back in those days. I did a semester in Knowles there, and we had all the fancy gear and everything, and it was still one of the most miserable. I mean, miserable in a good way, but it toughened me up as far as the rain and the cold, and it's always just warm enough so it doesn't snow.
Yes.
So it's maybe 35-degree rain. And, you think about those guys in leather boots.
Yes.
And, I mean, that book is great.
My wife is a fourth-generation Coloradan. I'm, on my mother's side, a fourth-generation Oregonian. And when we were first dating, she went out in over Christmas, and she's like, I've never been this cold in my life. It's like, it's not really that cold. It's just bone-chilling, damp, and wet.
Yeah.
And to not have heated homes and Gore-Tex, it would have been a miserable experience.
Yeah, I'm glad you liked that book. I thought that book was wonderful. I thought it's great information, but it's really, really well written. It's easy to read. It almost reads like fiction. Do you have any favorite documentaries that you like?
One that really touches home to me came out within the last year or so, called Antarctica: A Year on Ice. Ooh. And my father had spent a year in McMurdo Sound back in the late 50s in the International Geophysical Year.
Oh, wow.
Back at the time where there was like nothing there. I mean, now there's a major science encampment.
Sure.
But a New Zealand photographer and technical guy who's worked in McMurdo for, I think he's something like 15 years, did this documentary of wintering over, and the sights and experiences were just spectacular. And it's a place where my father had told me about his experiences there, and that was in some ways what drove me to get into a lot of this outdoor stuff. So being able to see it and see what few people have ever seen was just a magical experience for me.
I have not seen that. I need to check that out. Other than hang out on 14ers, what else do you do for fun? Do you have any other hobbies? I know you've got a son. Do you guys get out?
We do. I mean, I try to not be that dad that's pushing him and hating it. But, I've always been sort of what I call a jock of all trades. So, runner, cyclist, skier, have all of the gear for whatever seems to be the right thing to do. One of the activities that I started getting into right as I left the Northwest was sea kayaking, which not so many opportunities around here, but whenever I'm in other places and I can do that, I love that. And again, not a good sport for Colorado, but I really enjoyed snorkeling and was just out in Western Australia with my family visiting a good friend out there, and was snorkeling and seeing some pretty cool coral and fish, and love that. And I also had a friend of mine gave me the nickname, so if I'm on like 14ers.com, there's this guy Yard Man. So I love gardening and botany, playing around with that, and reading whenever I get the chance.
Sure. That's great. So you just told the story about the lightning strike, but I like asking people, what's the craziest thing that's ever happened to you in the outdoors? That's pretty crazy. Do you have anything that tops that?
Well, actually, the most sort of surreal experience was back when I was in my more technical rock climbing days. I'd gone up with some friends to Squamish, British Columbia, which is a little bit north of Vancouver. And we were climbing this route called Deidre on the Squamish Chief, the big rock formation there. And we had I had just led this pitch up. I think it was it's like a 6-pitch climb, and I think it was the fifth one. And I'd run out all of my gear, and I had just gotten to the anchors, and it just clipped in. And all of a sudden, this thing, bam, just hits me on the shoulder. And I'm like freaking out, like, oh, was that a rock? What's happening? Am I going to die? And it was because there was a way you could hike up higher onto a ledge system. And someone had thrown like half a cantaloupe off after they had eaten the cantaloupe, and this thing hit me, and I went from first thinking, my God, I'm going to die, like, oh, I got cantaloupe all over me. So I would have to say that's probably the most just bizarre,
very bizarre.
Weird.
That's it's a good thing it wasn't watermelon. You thought you were bleeding all over the place.
I really would have thought that there was need for panic.
So you've spent time in the Pacific Northwest, Colorado, some time in California. Do you have a favorite place in the West? That's hard. I don't know what mine would be.
It would be equivalent to asking a parent of multiple kids which one's your favorite. I mean, I've truly been so blessed in my life and my career to have gone all over the place. I would have to say, though, that the Yosemite and the Tuolumne Meadows area has been, I mean, that was where that fundamental life-changing day was for me when I was 13. I've also had, with some really good friends, some great climbs up on the high peaks in Tuolumne. That's a special place. The north side of Mount Hood, which was Mount Hood was my playground growing up, and one of my first technical mountaineering routes was up there. And so, I don't know, so hard to narrow it down to like a favorite place, but those are a couple of my favorites.
Well, you're the fourth podcast, and so 2 of the 4 have said Yosemite. So and I've never been there. It's ridiculous.
Okay, you have to go.
I know.
It is.
It's unacceptable.
It is just stunning, and you think what it must have been like when Muir was wandering around there. Without the hordes of people. But even with them, you get out into some of the more remote places, and get up in the valley is just so dramatic with the cliffs and the waterfalls. But if you get up into Tuolumne Meadows, Cathedral Peak, I did a climb on Mathis Crest, which is like this giant sort of fin of rock, and you're both climbing up, but you're also doing this lateral climbing that just goes on in kind of this third, fourth, and moderate fifth class terrain, and the weather is usually wonderful out there in the summer.
I need to get there. It's absurd that I haven't been there.
Gas up the car.
And so last quick question is, what do you think the biggest challenge and opportunity is facing Colorado in the near future?
Without a doubt, population growth is the biggest challenge we face. My wife's family grew up here, and they'll talk about prior decades. My father-in-law worked in marketing when they were starting up Breckenridge back in the 60s. And they talk about, living in Aspen and Breckenridge when they were these, primitive little towns. And, you think how much that has changed. In the decade of the 90s, we were the third fastest growing state. In the decade of the aughts, we were, I think, fell to like 8th. But we're still always up in the top 10, if not the top 5. And so many of the people who move here are fit, outdoor-oriented, smart people who they want to come here for all of the lifestyle amenities, and they're the people who want to ski and climb. And, I'm illustrative of the problem. You're illustrative of the problem. And so it is both a challenge and an opportunity, because you're getting these people who are putting more demand on all of our outdoor resources, whether it's skiing in the winter or climbing in the summer. But you also have these people who are super passionate about it. So how do you channel that passion to protect these places and, as best we can, allow a lot of people to come without destroying the inherent natural, wonderful qualities of them? So it's, and as a transplant from another great Western state, it's hard for me to say, well, I drop the gate now. I'm here. These other people, they're causing the problem. So it's a sticky wicket for sure.
It definitely is. Yeah, whenever I'm sitting in traffic on I-25 and I start getting frustrated, I think, well, this is because of me. Coming in from North Carolina. So if you could make a request of people listening to this podcast, what would it be?
I think the most fundamental thing we need to inculcate into everyone who's doing these outdoor activities is a real sense of leave no trace, and in understanding about the environments you're going, whether it's the fragile alpine tundra resources up on the 14ers, whether it's the thin cryptobiotic soils near Moab in the desert. I mean, you need to know before you go what's unique about the places, how you need to channel your leave no trace knowledge in that particular area. I mean, we have so many people coming here. You don't want to throw up the gate and put in permit systems and say only X number of people get to have this experience. But the more that people are educated, the more that they're sort of humble in their approach to nature and not, we're not conquering these peaks. They're allowing us to have these times. So let's do the least impact to the natural resource, the plants, the animals. Let's try to coexist as best we can, because if we don't have that LNT approach, these peaks are going to be really in sad shape. And it's all the other places. It's the climbing areas, it's the mountain biking trails, it's all of the other great places. We got to protect it, and if we don't, and that's from individual actions, it's going to be a worse experience for the next person.
Yep. So how can people connect with CFI?
We have a couple of different ways. Again, we have people who are interested in supporting us and following us from all over the world. So our website is a main portal. That's the numbers 14 and the letters ers.org. From there, you can link to a number of different other social media channels that we have. Our most popular for just staying involved is our Facebook page. We also have a YouTube library that now has more than 40 educational videos.
Those are great, by the way.
About our work. Thank you.
Yeah.
We're coming out with a series this summer that we're going to try to shoot about alpine wildlife. So we did a series on botany. Now we're going to try to focus on, the marmots and pikas and mountain goats and ptarmigan and other wildlife that you'd see up in the alpine, what's unique about them and what's the behavior you need to have around them. Particularly important if you're on a peak like Quandary or some of the ones in Chicago Basin where you have all these mountain goats. And people will get up there not realizing, these guys are they could really do quite a lot of damage to
very
you.
quickly.
Or more importantly, if your dog's up there unleashed, I'd bet on the goat on that encounter. So those are ways people can stay abreast of what we're doing and get engaged. We have a variety of volunteer projects over the summer. We have need for people we call peak stewards, who are volunteer educators that go out, talk about Leave No Trace, help try to get hikers attuned to the unique needs of the 14ers. And so all of those things come through our website and other channels.
Yeah, you guys seem to have a really great presence online with the YouTube videos are great. I think that's a very smart thing to do. It takes a lot of effort, I would think, to produce those things.
It's another one of those horrible days when you're out there with experts on the peaks, having them share their passion for the place. I mean, it's one of those where I should be paid time and a half to do that.
All right, well, I think that is it. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Ed. This has been a pleasure.
There you have it, another episode in the books. I hope you enjoyed that conversation as much as I did. Lloyd and his team at the 14ers Initiative are doing very, very important work. And he's a great guy and a really interesting guy, and I thoroughly enjoyed that conversation. So if you have a chance, go to the Colorado 14ers Initiative website, go to their Facebook, check them out, donate some money if you can. They do a great job, and it ensures that everybody, me, you, and everybody in the future will be able to access these great mountains that make Colorado so special. Thanks to Mountain Khakis for their support, and I will look forward to talking with you soon. Thanks. Bye.